So, age of first sexual intercourse and number of lifetime sexual partners. So if you had intercourse when you were 12 and younger, you're going to have almost 21 lifetime sexual partners on average. And you can see this number declining. And if you are 26 plus, you're only going to have 1.8 sexual partners, lifetime sexual partners. Now, there are, of course, two fundamental reproductive strategies in nature and also within human societies. One is where it's called the spray and pray, or there's other names for it as well. And what happens is you just have sex with a wide variety of people and you hope that your offspring make it to adulthood. And this has a lot to do with fatherlessness, and this also has a lot to do with incredible social dysfunction, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. The other is where you pair bond and you heavily invest in your children, a stable, cohabiting, marital union, at least for the duration of the maturation of the kids, so 20, 25 years at the outside, 25 years when the brain finally sort of matures. And the more sexual partners you have, the more you are biologically programmed to pursue this spray and pray reproductive strategy, which is kind of what frogs and turtles and other animals do, whereas mammals tend to focus a little bit more on the long-term pair bonding and investment strategy for kids. So this is not just, variety, hey, it's a spice of life, but this fundamentally undermines social cohesion and social stability, really civilization itself. The more sexual partners you're likely to have, the more society is programming itself for short-term reproductive strategies and a lack of investment in children. So, number of sexual partners per year outside of marriage. And if you are sexually active, if you become sexually active between the ages of 13 or 14, you have a sexual partner turnover rate that is 4 times higher than those who become sexually active in their early 20s. If it's 12 or younger, you have almost 2 new partners per year. If you are in your early 20s, it's 0.3 per year. So these are, again, foundational things to understand when we try to figure out what's going right and wrong with society. Let's look at sexually transmitted diseases. Age of first sexual intercourse. If you are 12 or younger, then you are likely to be infected at a rate of 20%. 20% of those will be infected. 18% of girls who began sexual activity at the ages of 13 or 14 have contracted syphilis or gonorrhea, chlamydia, genital warts or genital herpes, or self-report a high likelihood of HIV. And as you can see, once you start to get into your early 20s, mid-20s, it goes down to 4.9%, 26 plus 4.3%. And of course, some of these sexually transmitted diseases stick around for your whole life, can interfere with fertility, can have serious health consequences. So this again is important. Early sexual activity makes you much more likely to be a carrier of STDs. Number of non-marital sexual partners, STDs. And this is, have you ever been infected? And remember, this is the cutoff is 44 years old. So if you've had 21 or more non-marital sexual partners, then you're almost 42% likely to have ever been infected with an STD. And you can see this number scaling back down to, if you've only had one non-marital sexual partners, it's 4.9%, so 8 or 9 times less. So this is important as well. STDs are a scourge and an expensive scourge on society. One of the reasons why medical costs continue to go up around the world, and particularly in the West, is because of the prevalence of STDs. So what are your odds of ending up in a stable marriage? A stable marriage is if you're 30 or older and you've been in a marriage for 5 or more years. It doesn't mean a permanent marriage, but at least it means you're not just hooking up in the dark while your head is spinning. So contrasted with women who began sexual activity in their early 20s, girls who initiated sex at ages 13 or 14 were less than half as likely to be in stable marriages once reaching their 30s. If it's 12 or younger, you have a less than 19% chance of being in a stable marriage. If you started in your 20s, 66, 68% likelihood of being in a stable marriage. This is very important when it comes to choosing your partners in the future. This is the data you need to know to make an informed decision. If you looked at this kind of graph when you were considering things like investment returns or stability of a portfolio, you'd be very interested in this stuff. This is even more important than any of that. This is going to help you to determine your best chances to avoid the emotional and financial catastrophe of divorce. So, number of non-marital sexual partners, women 30 plus in stable marriages. Of course, if you want to get married, you want to stay married, and that's usually what the vows have implicit in them. Until death do us part, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. So look at these odds. If you only have had sex with the man that you get married to, then you have a greater than 80% chance when you're over 30 of being in a stable marriage, of retaining a stable marriage. If you've had one sexual partner outside of your husband or future husband, then this drops from 80.5% to 53.6% chance of maintaining a stable marriage. And as you can see, this goes down and down and down. It's mostly dose dependent, but not entirely. If you've had 16 to 20 non-marital sexual partners, your odds of staying in a stable marriage are only 17.8%. Compare that to over 80% for zero. There is a reason why deferral of sexual gratification and monogamy and marriage were focused on in prior cultures and societies. There was a reason for it. And I'm not sort of talking about the values and virtues and how it was communicated and all of that. I may have issues with that. But there was still a reason why this stuff happened. To throw all of this stuff out without understanding the negative effects is problematic, to say the least. What about out-of-wedlock pregnancy percentage? Look, this is not to be negative towards single mothers, but the reality is that the welfare state is almost exclusively the single mother supplement state. If you take the father, the provider traditionally, out of the equation, the needs of the mother and the children don't vanish. They're still there, and they're filled by state power. So if you care about taxes and debt and deficits and poverty and children in poverty, then reducing out-of-wedlock pregnancy and single motherhood is of primary importance. And so over half of all girls who start sexual activity at the ages of 15 or 16 will become pregnant out of wedlock, which means without the stability of a regular provider. For the most part, again, there are some common law and shack-em-up situations that work out well, but in general. And as you can see, this is very dose dependent. What are your odds of having a baby out of wedlock? If you start sexual activity in your mid-20s, 15.8%, as opposed to 75% out of wedlock chance if you're 12 and younger when you start having sexual intercourse. Number of non-marital sexual partners, out of wedlock pregnancy percentage. Society has a huge interest in promoting stability within marriage and promoting stability of provision for children. So if you're a virgin at the time of your first marriage, you have a 1.7% chance of having an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Now, if you have had 16 to 20 sexual partners, you have a 55.2% chance of having an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Again, mostly dose-dependent, and as you can see, if you've had premarital sex with your first husband, so it's 1.7% out-of-wedlock pregnancy percentage if you're a virgin. If you've had premarital sex, it goes to 16.3%, almost a tenfold increase. Out-of-wedlock childbearing percentage. And this is very important as well. Age of first sexual intercourse. So of 12 and younger, 43% out-of-wedlock childbearing percentage. If you go down to starting your sexual activity in your early 20s, down to the single digits, 9.1%, 8.4%, and so on. 11.7% of mothers who began sexual activity in their early 20s were living in poverty when surveyed, compared to 27% who began at ages 13 or 14. Look, we all know this is a basic reality that sex is a big person's game that makes real people. And those people, those children, those babies, I'm a stay-at-home dad, have been for 6 years. Those children need enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources. And those resources have to come from somewhere. And if you've noticed your tax rates ever increasing and the national debt's ever increasing, of course, some of it has to do with the military-industrial complex, some of it has to do with rent-seeking by large corporations, but some of it also has to do with the giant sucking sound of resources required for the raising of children, which is why the light-fingered regulations and taxation of the fingers are riffling through your wallet, leaving it much barer. Percentage of children born to unmarried women. 1/3 out of every 100 children conceived each year will be aborted. 1/3 will be born out of wedlock. And 1/2 of those born to married parents will see their parents divorced before they reach the age of 18. This is a catastrophe for the children, as we will get into in a few minutes. But if you look in 1950, about 4% of children were born to unmarried women. And it seems to have leveled off in the last few years, but it's over 40% now. And this just means the government has to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And social transfers from the unborn, I mean, you're basically stealing from the infants' children-to-be in order to give money to their unwed mothers and to give medical resources and to give schooling and educational resources to the mothers now, which is a huge and challenging problem. We're having children dropping them into a well of poverty because there are not stable providers around. What about a woman's chance to have had an abortion? Well, if you've not had sex outside of your marital partner, 7.7% of the women in the age range mentioned at the beginning of this presentation have had an abortion. This is very dose dependent. By the time you get to 21 or more non-marital sexual partners, a woman is more than 50% likely to have had an abortion. Now, abortion, of course, is a tragedy for the mother. It's a tragedy for, obviously, the fetus that does not get to live. And whatever we can do to diminish the prevalence of abortion, I think would be a good thing. And again, there's reasons why sexual restraint was preached early on. Now, sexual restraint, to be realistic and fair and to avoid the stigma of, you're just a square, you're a prude, man, you just want us to not even have any sex. But the reality is that people who are in stable long-term marriages report the happiest and best sex lives of everyone. So when people are saying, well, it might be a good idea not to cast sperm and eggs around like you're playing lacrosse, it might be a good idea to wait and focus on one person you're going to have sex with for the rest of your life. Nobody's saying, and therefore don't have sex. What they're saying is, that's going to give you the best sex. That's going to give you the most sex, the most satisfying sex, and that is the reality of what the data tell us. So it's not anti-sexual. It's not anti-pleasure. It's not anti-hedonism of the marital bedroom. What it is saying, well, look, if you wait, it's going to be better. I mean, you'll have much less chance of getting a disease. You'll have much less chance of having an abortion. You'll have much less chance of having a divorce. And all of that will contribute to, a happy tsunami of sexual pleasure for your whole life. So it's sort of like don't eat your dessert before your main course. How can you have any pudding if you haven't eaten your meat? So if you look at women who had sexual activity began in their early 20s, they've only had 12% of those who have had an abortion. If you start at the age of 12 or younger, it's 34.7%, and almost 30% at the ages of 13 or 14. And again, abortions are expensive and time-consuming in terms of medical resources. What are your odds of becoming a single mother? And being a single mother means that you just have far fewer resources to provide to your children. It's just a basic reality. Only so many hours in the day. If there's two parents around, you have at least twice the resources in general to provide to your children. So if you're 12 or younger when you first have sexual intercourse, you have a 65.4% likelihood of becoming a single mother. This is very dose dependent. If you start having sexual intercourse in your early 20s, it's down to 15.7%. So about a quarter odds. And that is very important stuff. Number of non-marital sexual partners. What are your odds of becoming a single mother if you have only had sex with your husband? 7.1%. If you've had 21 or more sexual partners, it's 57%. And this is dose dependent. And like a lot of these graphs, you can see how from 0 to 1, it's a huge jump. It's a huge jump. So if you've only had sex with your husband, 7.1% chance of becoming a single mother. If you've had sex with one other man outside your husband, over 4 times as much, 30.2% likelihood of becoming a single mother. So we're going to start to get into some of the data that is original to this presentation, and I would argue essential to understanding where society is heading and what has been happening really since the post-war period. So this chart, the fill is underage children of single parents per 100,000, and the red line is percent single mother families. So of course from 1968, we're looking at just over 10% to 26 or so percent now. And this is a very, very rapid change. This, of course, is just over 40 years. Now, what you can see, and we'll talk about this when we talk to social violence and criminality, on the right-hand side of this graph, there's an increasing gap. And what that means is that there are more single mothers, that continues to grow, but the single mothers are having fewer children. And this gap really began to show up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and has really created the largest gap in history now between these two. So this is important as we go forward to remember that there are more single mothers, but they're having fewer children. Now, what are the challenges of becoming a single mother? Well, first, we talked about this, is that you just tend to vote for bigger government, more redistributionist government, more socialist policies, more government programs. And statistically, this is quite well borne out that single mothers trend towards voting Democrat, and married women tend towards voting Republican. And that's because married women don't want their husbands to be taxed too much to pay for the sexual irresponsibility or traumas of the single mothers. And again, not to be negative towards single moms, all we've ever seen in the media and in presentations of this information is, the noble, heroic single moms who are doing a stellar job of raising their children and doing just as well as if they'd been a husband. Statistically, that's the complete opposite of the truth, but we know the effects and power of propaganda, so I wanted to sort of be clear on that. Every reasonable, decent, moral human being, and I certainly count you, and hopefully me in this category, is concerned about the welfare of children and is fundamentally opposed to any conditions and situations which increase the likelihood of child abuse. Child abuse is so foundational to social dysfunction that when child abuse rises above a certain level, society's doom is almost guaranteed. I've actually got an audiobook reading of Lloyd DeMoss's The Origins of War in child abuse, which you can get for free at freedomainradio.com/free, which I hope you will check out. So let's look at what keeps children the safest. Rates of maltreatment by family structure. Married biological parents is incredibly low. It's incredibly rare for either serious or moderate child abuse to occur in married biological parent unions. Next highest, and it's a significant increase, 3 to 4 times higher. Unmarried parents are 3 to 4 times more likely to abuse their children. Single parents higher still, though it's not quite as high. The most dangerous familial environment for a child is single parent with partner, and this generally means a woman with a live-in boyfriend. So for serious child abuse, we go from 2.6 for married biological parents to 20.8 rates per 1,000 single parent with partner. Moderate child abuse goes from 4 per 1,000 married biological parents to 33. 7, 8, 9 times higher. 33 for a single parent with a partner. The most dangerous place for children. Of course, the safest place for women as well is not off campus, but in a married permanent partnership. Let's look at problem behaviors of children. Parents' marital status. So the red columns are divorce, and the right columns are intact marriages. Lied about something important, far more likely to happen for children of divorce. Stole from a store, many times more likely, almost 4 times more likely to have stolen from a store, children of divorce. Damaged school property, slightly more likely. Gotten drunk, almost 5 times more likely. Hurt someone enough to need a doctor, almost twice as likely. Had to bring parents to school, 6.6 versus 3.1. Skipped school without permission, almost twice as likely. So these are problem behaviors in kids of divorce. These all cost money, they all cost resources. Now, let's look at this track. Violent crime and single motherhood from 1960 onwards. Violent crime rate rises to track with single motherhood. Now, there is a gap here on the right-hand side. The violence tended to peak in the early to mid-90s. It's been declining since. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, and nobody knows for sure what they are, least of all me. I would hypothesize that the internet, video games, and so on have all created a better to be indoors situation to vent. Plus, of course, single moms are having fewer kids, and therefore there's going to be a drop in violent crime. So again, this is not explanatory. There are lots of different ways that this could be occurring, but it's important to note the initial trend. And it may not be single motherhood in particular, but let's look at how violent crime and divorce track in the United States, 1960 to 2011. Now, correlations, these are statistical ways of comparing disparate trends. So a 1.0 is a perfect correlation, a photocopy, a photograph. 0 is no correlation. Anything more than half is something really worthy of attention. So the correlation between rates of divorce and violent crime, or numbers of divorce and violent crime, is 0.85. Incredibly strong. Divorce has been declining, of course, and I think this is another reason why violence is declining. This is truly staggering. Look at these correlations. Divorce and property crimes. The divorce rate and property crime rate has a correlation of 0.96. 0.96. That is staggering. The argument could be made, and I made it in the Truth About Robin Williams video, that divorce is itself a kind of property crime. But children of divorce seem to have a pretty lax relationship to respect for property rights. So this is why you need an alarm system. This is why your car has gone missing. This is why you have problems. This is why you don't feel secure. This is why you roll your windows up. Because there is this, has been this epidemic of divorce, which again is beginning to level off, and we're going back into hopefully not too much of a pendulum swing the other way. But 0.96, anything which makes divorce easier gets stuff stolen almost in a direct correlation. Now, this is not to say everyone has to stay in miserable marriages and so on, but the reality is, statistically, this has been well borne out, that the majority of people who get divorced wish they hadn't. And the majority of people who don't get divorced are glad that they didn't, sort of 5 years later. It's not a huge percentage excess, but a lot of people get divorced prematurely. And of course, if you've got a revolving door of sexual partners, then divorce is going to be easier for you psychologically, although harder for you in the long run psychologically, and harder for society as a whole. Mothers living in poverty, percentage. Age of first sexual intercourse, 12 and younger. A third of you will end up living in poverty. And if you start later in life, late teens, early 20s, it goes down to 11.9%, 11.7%. So a third of the likelihood to end up in poverty if you delay sexual gratification, at least with someone else. What about happiness? What is going to make you happy? Well, if you are 12 and younger when you have your first sexual intercourse, you're only 20% likely to end up happy, at least in the age range, again, in the Heritage Survey. And this rises fairly dose-dependently. 13 to 14, you have a 33.5% chance, and you can see it goes up. And if you delay till your your late teens, early 20s, 48, 51.2%, and so on. Now, please don't lecture me too much if you can at all stand it on the reality that correlation does not equal causation. I fully understand that. The reason why girls will have sex when they're 12 and younger, or 13 or 14, has to do with significant amounts of family dysfunction. And with the early menstruation that appears with father absence, and with the fact that women who report being closer to their fathers end up being virgins much later on. It is a hunger for masculinity. And also, of course, if men are missing from a family, the female body primes itself for a short-term reproductive strategy because it assumes it's war, it's famine, there's some reason why men aren't around. The way that you conduct yourself sexually and romantically actually programs the bodies of your children for particular reproductive strategies. And they're not impossible to shake. You can change over time, but it's hard to do so. And society cannot function if a significant proportion of the population is in short-term reproductive strategy mode. It simply cannot function. Number of non-marital sexual partners. Again, we're looking at this number. If you've only ever had sex with your husband, 55.9% chance of being happy, down to 32% chance of being happy if you've had 21 or more sexual partners. So this is what I mean when I say this delay of gratification for intercourse is not about be repressed. It's not about be a prude. It's not about be Victorian. It's about, wait and get it right. Be happy. There are a near endless set of negative outcomes that have been uncorked by taking this genie of fantasy, recreational, consequence-free sexuality out of the bottle. And we see this in movies all the time. It's like, hey, let's meet for a latte and shag in the toilet. And this never seems to lead to pregnancies or STDs, and occasionally you get Glenn Close popping up in your kitchen as a bunny boiler. But for the most part, it is all consequence-free, all recreational. Like, sex is just a toy for you to enjoy. It's like, no, sex is the reason why we're here. Sex is the reason it's a big person's game that makes real people. So it's important to know, and this is the information I want to get across to you, if you view sex as just this personal proletariat plaything of infinite personal pleasure, well, the odds are that it's going to end badly for you, and like really badly. Not just STDs, which are bad enough, but unwanted pregnancies, abortions, divorce, children growing up alienated and unhappy and problematic. And, it's the old thing. If you don't have time to get it right now, how on earth are you going to have time to get it right later if your kids have gone off the rails? So find the right partner. I've made the case, and you can get this in the free book, Real-Time Relationships, The Logic of Love, that love is our involuntary response to virtue. If we're virtuous, find the right person, find someone you can love, find someone you can respect, find someone that you can treasure. Someone told me when I was young, it was a neighbor of mine actually in England. He said, if you don't get married and stay married, you can maybe date 10 or 20 people or maybe a little more over the course of your life. He said, but if you get married and you stay married, you get to date thousands of people because you and your partner are constantly changing and constantly growing. And it really, really stuck with me. And I've been blissfully married for over 13 years now, and we're going to be together until we're on the table at the Jeffersonian. So the negative consequences are huge. STDs, out-of-wedlock pregnancies, out-of-wedlock births, single motherhood, the giant increase in the in-state power and indebtedness and taxation to pay for all of this stuff, single-parent homes. Coming from a single-parent home is that factor alone is the biggest single predictor of a negative outcome for a child, more than socioeconomic status or race or any of those things. And again, it's not to say that all single moms are bad, but we're just looking at the statistics. Maternal and child poverty vastly increase with this sexual revolution, which is just the same late Roman Soviet mess that's happened before. Decreased marital stability and happiness makes the lawyers happy, but look, statistically women, and children in particular, but women are by far the best off if let's just say women are the best off if they restrain their sexual activity within the confines of a marriage. They're happier, they're sexually more fulfilled, they're more secure, they're physically safer, and their children are safer. And surely that should be enough to give us pause and spray some Freon on our naughty parts, at least for the time being. So thank you so much for watching.